Hello everybody. Welcome to this morning's Speakers for Schools virtual talk. We're delighted you've been able to join us today. This session will last for around 40 to 45 minutes and will include a presentation from our speaker before moving to student Q&A. Questions for today's speaker can be submitted via the Q&A function on the right-hand side of your screen, and this will be open towards the end of the presentation. Unfortunately, we will not be able to answer all submitted questions. We have several hundred questions submitted in every virtual talk we've organised, and there's simply not enough time to answer them all, but rest assured they have been received. I'm delighted to welcome this morning's speaker, Julian Jessop. Julian's an economist and has kindly agreed to join us today to discuss, should the voting age be lowered to 16? Julian, hi, welcome to your Speakers for Schools virtual talk.
Hi, good morning everybody.
Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Pleasure.
I think you have a presentation to get us started, which is all on screen and all visible for students, and then we'll move to some student Q&A afterwards.
That's great. Okay, well, let's get going then. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start with a quick quiz. Now, normally I give this talk in a room with students in front of me, but I think we can just about do it online as well. So I can't hear your answers or see them, but it'll be interesting to see what you think the answers might be. I'm then going to talk a little bit about how Britain voted in the last general election in 2019. It feels like a lifetime ago, but it was only a few months now. I'm then going to talk about the current rules for voting age across the UK. Interestingly, they are different in different parts of the country. I'm then going to move on to the meat of this, the case for changing the UK-wide voting age to 16. And also, in the interest of balance, the case for sticking at 18. And then finally, I had just a few questions that you might want to go away and think about. Normally, again, I'll be debating these face to face, but some of the issues might also come up in the Q&A that I can answer afterwards. So let's start with the quiz. My first question, there's a list of things that you may or may not want to do. Which of these can you do in Scotland at 16, but not in England? In other words, in England, you have to be older than 16 to do these things. So I've got four options here. The first is, get married without your parents' permission. The second is to leave school and to do nothing. So by that, I mean, not going into paid employment or training or any form of further education. You can just sit around and do whatever you want. And then the third thing is, can you vote in local elections and referendums at 16 in Scotland, but not in England? And then finally, I've got a fourth option, which is all of the above. So is it possible to get married without your parents' permission in Scotland, to leave school and do nothing, and to vote in local elections and referendums, even though you're not allowed to do so in England? I'll just give you a few seconds just to think about that. Well, here's the answer. The answer is all of the above, actually. In Scotland, you can get married without your parents' permission at 16. In England, you have to wait until you're 18. You can leave school and do nothing. You can also, importantly, vote in local elections, so elections to the Scottish Parliament and also the referendum on Scottish independence in, I think it was 2014, 16-year-olds were able to vote, whereas, for example, 16-year-olds were not able to vote in the UK-wide referendum on leaving the European Union, the Brexit referendum. I'm guessing, and this is one that often people get right, is the first one, the get married without your parents' permission. There's a bit of history here. There's a long tradition of young English couples eloping to somewhere called Gretna Green, which is a small Scottish village just north of the Scottish-English border. And that gets a tradition that goes back to the 18th century. There was a marriage act in England and Wales that allowed a parent to block the marriage of anybody aged under 21 in England and Wales, but only applied in those two countries. At the time, boys could actually marry in Scotland at 14 and girls at just 12 without their parental consent. So a lot of very young people in England would nip over the border to get married in Scotland. So many people guess the first one is right, but also the key points also about leaving home, leaving school without necessarily getting a job, and also the ability to vote. Second question is who pays tax? Who pays some form of tax, whether that's income tax or taxes on spending, whatever else it might be. I mean, at what age do you start paying tax? And here again, I've got four answers. The first is only adults aged 18 or over pay tax. The second is anyone in paid employment, as long as they're 16 or over. The third answer is anyone in paid employment regardless of their age. And then the fourth answer is anyone. So everyone, but in principle, could pay tax if they meet certain criteria. So which one of these is right? The reason I've got this question up here is people often think that's relevant to the voting age. They say that if you can pay tax at 16, why shouldn't you be able to vote? Well, the answer to this question actually again is everyone in principle can pay tax. Unless you're completely detached from society and the economy, unless you're an off-grid hermit, there will be some form of tax that you are likely to pay. You may not be paying income tax because you're not earning enough money. By the way, you can pay income tax at any age. If you're a brilliant child actor, if you're in Harry Potter, for example, and you're 8 and you earn enough money, you will pay tax. Even if you don't earn any money, the chances are you're spending some. So if you go to the shops and buy sweets, for example, there'll be sugar taxes on those sweets. So you will be paying taxes regardless of your age. So in a sense, it's a bit of a red herring for the voting age, because you can pay tax at any age. It has been a big issue, though, particularly in American politics over the years. So one of the big grievances that American colonists had against the English King George was the idea that the English Parliament could raise taxes that American colonists had to pay, even though there were no Americans in the British Parliament at the time. So this is the idea of no taxation without representation. It's one of the factors behind the famous Boston Tea Party in 1773, where colonists rebelled against the different treatment of taxes on tea, depending who was importing the tea. But you can sometimes always turn this around, and some people say that there should be no representation without taxation. So it's sometimes said that young people shouldn't be able to vote because they don't pay enough tax, have a big enough financial stake in the decisions that they're making. And my final question is, if only young people defined as those under 25 were allowed to vote, then who would currently be our Prime Minister? So I've got the 4 options here: Boris Johnson, Jeremy Corbyn, Caroline Lucas from the Green Party, and Joe Swinson from the Liberal Democrats. So if only youngsters under 25 were allowed to vote, who would have won the election last year? Well, here's the answer. It would have been Jeremy Corbyn. Actually, he'd be Prime Minister by quite a long way. There's overwhelming evidence that young people are far more likely to vote for Labour and for other parties. Instead of Jeremy Corbyn, we've got Boris Johnson, which you may or may not think is a good thing, but it's certainly given plenty of opportunity for funny memes and photos. So this is a really interesting difference. This breaks down the voting by age in the last general election. Actually, it's been a consistent pattern for many years. So you can see that the bars represent the different age groups. At the top, we've got the 18 to 24 age group, and you can see that age group overwhelmingly votes Labour. Much smaller proportion voted Conservative. And then as you get older, it's really interesting. People are far more likely to vote Conservative, far less likely to vote Labour. Whereas the split for other parties is pretty constant. So Lib Dems consistently polling to 11, 12, 13 points. There really is this huge difference between Labour and Conservative in terms of the age of their voters. And that's actually pretty much the biggest single difference that seems to determine how you vote. Other things that you might look at, for example, the sorts of jobs that you do, your income and so on, don't seem to make a lot of difference. Age is the most important factor. The only thing that comes remotely close to that is your level of education. So the more educated that you are, the more likely you are to vote Labour, which is interesting. Now, there's a bit of an overlap here, of course. If you're younger, then you're more likely to have been to university. More people now go to university than would have been the case 20, 30, 40 years ago. So there's a bit of an overlap here. This is, younger people are more likely to go to university and also more likely to vote Labour. So the two things are slightly merged. But it is interesting that the more educated you are, the more likely you are to vote Labour. The other big difference, which again is important actually for the issue of voting age, is the turnout. If you're older, you're far more likely to vote. So you can see here again, general election 2019. Less than 50% of young people voted compared to nearly 3/4 of older people. Now, a lot of people, of course, see that as a problem. You know, we're not getting people engaged in politics early enough. There might be a number of factors around that. One, for example, is a lot of people in that younger age group are at university and perhaps they're not properly registered to vote in the place that they live. They're only registered to vote at home or not at all. So there's some issues around voter registration, but there's certainly been a long time a pattern of older people being more likely to vote than younger people. So what are the current rules? This slide summarises the state of play in the UK and in Europe. So as you're probably aware, the voting age for parliamentary elections in the UK, so this is the nationwide elections like the general election, it is 18. But there are differences. In Scotland, you can vote at 16 in local and other devolved elections. So that included the independence referendum in 2014. Recently, Wales has followed Scotland, so you can now vote at 16 in Wales as well. Other parts of the UK actually moved to 16 quite a long time ago. So the Isle of Man and Jersey, you could vote at 16 in 2006 and 2007 respectively, which I think is interesting. And so they've had plenty of years of experience of people voting at 16. And the feedback there has mostly been positive. So for example, some issues like the availability of youth centres have been discussed much more seriously. They're much more important because people who use youth centres are able to vote. So that's been a positive experience. Across the rest of the European Union, at the moment, the norm is still 18, not 16. But there are a few exceptions. You can vote at 16 in Austria and Malta. And interestingly, you can vote in Hungary at 16 if you are married, but not if you are not. So it's quite a big difference. Generally speaking, it's 18, but there are some countries and parts of the UK where it is 16. So the big issue is where do you draw the line? I think everybody agrees that there needs to be an age at which you can vote. We can't allow infants to vote, much as I think this little chap here is protesting vehemently about something. I think there's an agreement you have to draw the line somewhere. The question is at what age this line should be drawn. And I think you can see that there's a good argument also for different minimum ages for different activities. So you might, for example, think that you'd have an older age for driving a public bus that lots of people might get on, that might be 21 or higher, or flying a commercial aircraft, than the age you might have for driving your own car if it's just you in it. So you might be able to drive a car at 17 but only drive a public bus at 21. So there's room for disagreement about what the age should be according to the sort of activity that you're undertaking. And there might even be room for disagreement about the voting age for different types of elections. So, for example, you might think that there's a case for a lower voting age in a local election, which is about local issues, than about something really big, a big national election or national referendum. So maybe that's something to think about as well, a different voting age if you're voting for a different sort of election. But the obvious starting point, perhaps, is what you can do at different ages. So this is the split if you're in England. It's slightly different in some of these cases in Scotland. I would say that, of course, in all of these, just because you can do these things doesn't necessarily mean that I'm advising you to go and do so, or even that society as a whole thinks it's a good idea for you to do that. But here are some quite big differences. So, for example, at 16, you can leave home. And by the way, your parents can also ask you to leave home. So be careful. That's a right that goes both ways. You can leave school as long as you're going into work full time or to further education. Interestingly, you can become a company director. So you can take legal responsibility for a business. Even though you can't vote, you can be responsible for running a company. And again, you can have sex with someone who is also over 16. Again, just because I say that doesn't mean I recommend you go ahead and do that. But there are lots of other rights that only kick in when you're 18. It's only at that point that you're considered financially responsible enough to get a mortgage or a credit card or a personal loan. It's only at 18 that you can serve on a jury. It's only 18 that you can fight in combat roles in the armed forces. You can join the army before 18 with your parents' permission, but you can't actually be sent to the front line. You can't become a police officer till you're 18. You can't buy alcohol, tobacco, or fireworks. and you can't gamble except the National Lottery, where the age is 16. So we do have these quite big differences between the rights you have at 16 and the rights you have at 18. So the meat of it, the arguments for votes at 16, I'll start with those. Now, I've listed 5 arguments here. I mean, there are others, but I think these are the strongest. The first is sort of a bit of logic or fairness. 16-year-olds already have lots of rights and obligations. Why not voting? We all expect 16-year-olds to be able to do lots of things. Why can't we have them to vote as well? I think it's also a good argument that young teens are now much better informed than, say, 20, 30, 40 years ago. Citizenship education in schools is I think, a lot better than it used to be. We also have the advantages, as some would see it, the disadvantages, as others would see it, of social media. So, young people are on top of the news in a way that they wouldn't have been before, and they're exposed to political advertising and other messages all the time. It's also an argument that if you're a young person, you're going to live with the consequences of political decisions for longer than older people. This was something that came up a lot in the Brexit referendum. Because a lot of the people who voted for Brexit were older. They were going to be around only for maybe 5 or 10 years, whereas younger people will be living with the consequences for sort of 30, 40, 50 years. So maybe there's a case for allowing younger people to vote earlier because they're going to have a bigger stake because they're going to be around for longer. There's also an inconsistency argument. I mean, it does seem odd that you can vote at 16 in Scotland, but you have to wait until you're 18 at UK-wide elections, particularly as voting in 16 in Scotland seems to work pretty well. And then finally, there's an argument about engagement. Remember I showed you earlier that the turnout for younger people is a lot lower than for older people. I think if you did have people voting younger, then that would encourage them to get involved sooner. It also might help with the problem of students not being registered properly, because if they're registered at 16, you can make sure that they're registered when they actually go to university as well. So there's a case for getting people involved earlier in order to get them more engaged for life. Voting is a habit. Start early, you stick with it. But there are also arguments for remaining with 18 as the voting age. I've listed them here. As it happens, I've got 6 rather than 5. Don't read too much into that, but here are my 6. A lot of the things that you can legally do at 16 are still not necessarily things that society would encourage you to do. So, for example, society doesn't feel it can stop you from getting married at 16 if you've got your parents' permission. But we don't really, I think, want you to do that. And it just feels that we can't stop you from doing that, but it's not something we'd actively encourage at that age. Similarly, things like running companies and so on. I think we'd rather you waited till a bit later before starting doing that. We just don't feel we can stop you from doing that. The second point is that most 16 to 17-year-olds are still children. They're living at home, going to school, and they're dependent on their parents. And they're like more susceptible to influence from their parents, and they also don't have a lot of experience yet of the real world. And that's my third point. So classroom teaching is great, and we have social media as well, but they're no substitute for experience of the real world. If you're unless you're going out there and earning and paying bills and maybe owning a home or renting a property, then you may not be as well experienced to make these judgments as somebody who isn't. About the point about age, I mean, fortunately these days most people can probably expect to live to 80 or 90. So I think the argument that you have to wait a couple of years until you're 18 before voting shouldn't make a huge difference. I mean, you've got plenty of time in your life to rest of your life to vote. As I showed earlier, 18 is still the threshold for most of life's major decisions, particularly sort of financial decisions, and when you're considered responsible enough to join the police or to fight in the army. And then my final point is that you can engage in politics without voting. I mean, there are other ways to be active in politics without necessarily having the vote. A couple of classic, great examples here. On the left is Greta Thunberg, who we all know, the environmental campaigner. She's still only 17, by the way. So in the UK, she wouldn't have a vote in the national election, but everybody is very well aware of her views, and she's had an enormous impact on thinking, even though she's not had a vote. And on the right is Malala. She's the Afghan girl who was shot by the Taliban, I think at the age of 14 for daring to go to school. And of course now she's very well known, has become a great campaigner for women's rights and children's rights in particular in the context of education. So it is possible to be active in politics even without having a vote. And there's no doubt that the opinions of young people are listened to, even if they don't necessarily count at the ballot box directly. Older people, adults, parents do listen to what their children have to say. So not only do you have a voice, but also you can protest. Sorry, I went backwards one. These are some images from a recent Black Lives protest. Unfortunately, these aren't the latest one. I mean, unfortunately, the Black Lives protests have been going on for quite a while. These are protests from 2014 in Ferguson, Missouri, following the police shooting of another black man called Michael Brown. So I'm afraid that what we're seeing in the last few days has been around for a while, but children have been participating in these demonstrations, and their voices have been heard. Finally, I think a little bit odd for me not to comment on the latest things that have been going on in the UK. I'm not going to offer a strong opinion here, but I'm just going to give you a couple of good slides, good quotes from two prominent political figures. One is Rishi Sunak, who, as you know, is the Chancellor of the Exchequer, so he's a Conservative politician, as it happens, also a British Asian man. I think his quote here, read on the screen, is very good. If you want to follow it up, he's on Twitter, and I think it's worth reflecting on that. And in interest of balance, something from the other side. So what the leader of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer, has said, and I think there is a sort of consensus here that, as far as that statue in Bristol is concerned, it was probably right that it should go, but perhaps some question marks about the way it was taken down, not being ideal. But these are the sorts of debates that young people are fully entitled to contribute to, and their voices will be heard, even if they don't necessarily have a vote. And then my final slide, just a few sort of questions to think about. The first is just come back to the point about why people who are younger seem to be so much more likely to vote Labour than Conservatives. I mean, I don't have a definite answer for that. I think different people will have different arguments. I think if you were a Labour supporter, you might argue, for example, that this shows how younger people are more progressive and forward thinking and so on. If you're a Conservative supporter, you might argue that this shows that Conservative older people have more sort of experience and wisdom and so on. So you might vote Labour when you're young, Conservative when you're older. I'm going to let people make their own minds up on those arguments. My second question is whether there's an argument for saying that younger people's vote should carry more weight than older people. So the vote of a young person might count for 2 votes, whereas the vote of an older person might count for 1. That's an interesting argument. You can sort of make the point that because younger people have to live with the consequences of decisions for longer, maybe their opinions should count for more. But against that, of course, it's extremely dangerous to start saying that one person's vote counts more than another. What if you then started saying that people who own property should have more votes, or people with better levels of education should have more votes? And then what about people who might have a life-limiting illness, might have a few years to live? Should they have no vote at all? It becomes very difficult, I think, if you do to start distinguishing between different people as having different numbers of votes. But that's a live topic. And then, of course, finally, the question I asked at the beginning, should the voting age be lowered to 16? It's always interesting to hear what young people themselves think about that. Often the outcome is a bit more evenly divided than I might otherwise have expected. So that's all of my formal presentation. I think we're now going to move to questions and answers. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Thank you so much, Julian. Much appreciated. We've had a lot of questions submitted on your presentation, which is fantastic, and a lot of students engaging with their answers to your initial questions as well, which is great. So I'll go through a few of those questions now, if that's okay. Fantastic. So one of our students has asked, do you think there should be an educational entry requirement to be able to vote at 16?
Short answer, no. I think I touched on this a few minutes ago. I think it's extremely dangerous if you start applying requirements to people to qualify to vote. I mean, suppose, for example, you've come from a relatively poor background, you haven't had a great education. One reason or another, not your fault. You may just not be very good at taking tests. Should you still not be allowed to vote? That doesn't sound right to me. You still might be expected to pay taxes. You might still be dependent on public services, education, healthcare, and so on. So it seems odd that just because you can't take a test or pass a test, you shouldn't be allowed to vote. I think if you're a full citizen of the United Kingdom, then I think the only test that I would apply would be the age test. Possibly a basic mental capacity test, and there is that. There are a few people who are of the right age who are not allowed to vote because they're not mentally able to do so, and there are a few other people like members of the House of Lords and certain members of the royal family who aren't allowed to vote, but they're clearly exceptions. But I think once you start imposing criteria that you've got to have a certain level of education or a certain level of income, or whatever, it becomes very, very dangerous. I think it's better to err on the side of letting more people vote rather than fewer.
Fantastic, thank you. And on that kind of similar line, Imogen has asked, do you think that people might be more willing to let 16-year-olds vote if there was more political education in schools, e.g. how to cast a vote and make an informed decision by looking at all party manifestos, etc.? Yes,
I mean, I'm a big fan of citizenship education, or whatever it's called in different schools. I think it's very important. I think there are lots of ways that schools can help children prepare for adult life. Citizenship education is one. I think personally, more education about personal finances is good as well. So when you are 18, you can take out a credit card. It'd be great if people have more understanding of how interest rates work, that sort of thing. So I think it is very important that there is good education around politics in schools. Two caveats though. One is I think it's very important that education is as balanced as it can be. I think there are lots of issues where sometimes children are presented with just one perspective. So, for example, on climate change, the war on plastics. I think children are often told that plastics are terrible. Maybe they're not told about some of the advantages of plastics as a way of keeping food fresh and so on, and there maybe isn't enough perspective on from different angles. The second thing I'd be worried about is is whether classroom education is enough to prepare you for the real world. I think you do need real world experience as well, and simply learning about something in a classroom may not be enough. But overall, I think it's a very strong argument. The better the education that people get at school around around politics and economics and all these other issues as well, the better prepared they are to vote. The more confident I personally would feel about lowering the voting age to 16 for everybody for all elections.
Fantastic, thank you. One of our students has also just said, I feel that if we can be given the rights to manage a company, which is a lot of responsibility for a 16-year-old, how can we not be given the right to vote? So I think that student might be in favour of voting at 16. Another of our students here have asked, the voting age seems to have become more symbolic than anything else. Do you think that without the vote, younger people's political opinions are taken less seriously?
Well, I think two very good points. I was actually surprised about the company director point. I didn't know that you could be a 16-year-old company director. I think that's actually a very interesting argument. That I think that's if you take all those responsibilities, then why not vote as well? On the second question of people being taken more seriously if they can vote, I mean there's a famous American song, where the senator says, sorry, I'd like to listen to what you have to say, but you're too young to vote. And there is a perception that adults don't take notice of what children have to say because they're not able to vote. I think that's a little bit cynical, actually. I think politicians are influenced by what they see on social media or on television, and the fact that, for example, a lot of 16 and 17-year-olds, and of course even younger than 16, are participating in protests around climate change or Black Lives Matter and so on. I think that does influence politicians, and of course remember also that adults themselves, often they are parents, so they are, when they vote, they are thinking about what is in the best interest of their children, and probably listening to what their children have to say. So I'm not sure that it would be right to say that just because you can't vote, you can't influence decisions. That said, there have been plenty of examples of when younger people have been able to vote, then younger people's issues have become more important in the campaign. So I mentioned the example of the Isle of Man and Jersey earlier. So things like the provision of youth centres and after school activities and so on became a big issue in those elections, precisely because 16 and 17-year-olds were able to vote. I think that's probably a good thing. I think, by the way, that's quite a good argument for saying that you might have a lower voting age for local elections than for national elections, because local elections are often about local issues like when the library is open and youth centres and so on. And those are services that are often used a lot by younger people, or at least they should be. So yes, I think there is some evidence at the margin that having a lower voting age changes the sorts of issues that are considered important. But there's also plenty of evidence that young people can still have a voice and still be listened to, even if they don't actually have a vote themselves.
Fantastic, thank you. A very interesting point from one of our students here who asks, if there's a restriction on the lower band for younger people to be able to vote, should there be a restriction on the upper age limit as well?
That's an interesting one. I obviously think no. It is sometimes suggested, by the way. There's, sometimes there should be a limit of 60, 70, 80, but I don't really see a good argument for that. The sorts of arguments that are made, I mean, one is that these people might only have a few more years to live, so why should they determine the future of the country over the next 20, 30, 40 years, whatever it might be. I'd actually turn that around. I'd say that older people are often people who've spent 50 years working, and they've maybe fought in wars for this country and so on. I think they've got at least as much right to determine the future of the country as somebody who's just maybe even still at school. So also, of course, older people have just as much at stake over the next few years. I mean, they're likely to be just as dependent on public services like the NHS, maybe more dependent. As they get older, they'll need more healthcare. They would have paid in an enormous amount, hopefully over their lifetimes, in terms of tax and so on. So I think they've got every right to determine how that money should be spent. So no, I wouldn't approve of an upper limit. I see no reason why, particularly with people becoming more active or remaining active as they get older, they shouldn't fully participate in politics for as long as they're around.
That's great. Thank you so much, Julian. One of our students here has asked, I think this is obviously quite an interesting debate that a lot of students are getting quite involved in, which is fantastic for what we can see through the Q&A thread. And one of our students asks, do you have any skills or tips for students for what they would need to debate topics? How can you go into a debate well prepared, and what skills do you need?
Okay. Well, first of all, I would sort of go online and try and find some people who are really good at this, and try and understand why you think they're good. So there are lots of people, actually young and old, who are just very good on television, good at giving short sound bites. And what's common about them, I think, is two things. First of all, confidence. They have confidence that they can deliver a good point well. Now, sometimes that just seems to be natural. They just naturally have that sort of confidence. But it's more usually because they've done a bit of research, and they've thought about the sort of 2 or 3 points that that they want to make, and they're going to put those 2 or 3 points across, and they've got sort of short sound bites that allow them to do that. The second trick that I've still not learned after years of doing this is to be determined to put your point across without necessarily answering the question you've been asked. So you see politicians in particular do this, but good speakers generally. If you've got a strong point you want to make, somebody asks you a question, you sort of feel you ought to answer the question, but actually make the point you want to make. Nobody will really notice what the question was. What they will do is listen to what you have to say. And there are various tricks that you can do to do that, saying, no, that's a really interesting question, but I think the key point is this, and then you make your key point. So it's really about preparation and confidence, and having a few key points that you want to put across, and just putting those points across, even if it isn't necessarily what you were asked. Those things I think would be the best tips. But do go away and look at those people that you think are good, and ask yourself, why are they good? What is it that they're doing that makes them impressive, whereas some others aren't?
That's some really great advice. Thank you so much. One of our students here has suggested that we should only allow 16-year-olds to vote on certain things. Do you think that's an interesting idea, a good idea, and how could that work?
Yeah, I think that is an interesting argument. I think, for example, there is a case for saying that younger people should be allowed to vote in local elections, but not necessarily national ones. And that's partly because of the local elections, particularly about sort of local issues where young people are going to be more heavily involved at the youth centre, for example. Maybe also because national elections are in a sense more important, and so you want a sort of higher threshold for being able to vote in those and being a bit older. Another interesting example though is referendums. I sometimes think there might be a case for a lower voting age for referendums, and that's for 3 reasons. First is referendums tend to be sort of once in a generation decisions, so they'll determine what's going to happen over the next 30 years, whereas elections happen every 3, 4, 5 years. So if you miss out on a referendum, you might not get another chance to vote for 30 years. So being slightly younger than the voting age could make a big difference. The second point is that referendums are often about a single issue, so it's a relatively simple question to answer, where elections for Parliament, there tend to be loads and loads of different issues. So maybe if it's a single issue, it might be more appropriate to let younger people vote. Not always, of course, because some single issues can be extremely complicated, like Brexit. Should we leave the European Union or not? It's a very complicated question. The third point, though, is often referendums are about what I would call sort of social issues. So they're not about economic issues. They're things like, in the case of the Republic of Ireland recently, should you allow same-sex marriage? Now, because that's a sort of an issue which isn't about life experience so much or about economics, maybe there is a case then for having a lower voting age than for a general election. So there might be a few examples where it's appropriate to have different voting ages for different elections, in the same way you have different ages for driving different types of vehicle. You can drive a moped at a much younger age than you can drive a commercial bus. So there are arguments. The argument against that, of course, is it gets complicated. How do you decide that a particular election is suitable for 16-year-olds rather than 18-year-olds? There is an advantage in simplicity having the same age for everybody. But I do think you can make arguments for saying that different elections should have different ages.
That's great. Thank you so much. Amelia, one of our students who's tuning in, is interested in what first got you interested in politics, Julian. What inspired your interest and I guess your passion for this topic as well? Yeah.
Well, in my case, I grew up in quite a political household. My father is and was and still is a professor of sociology and politics. So it was a very sort of political household. I remember doing mock elections when I was young. I remember being the Labour Party candidate in a mock election at my school. It was a certain type of school, and I got a grand total of 2 votes, one of which was from me. I'm not sure who the other person was, but I was very involved in politics, interested in politics at an early age. I did consider studying politics at university, but my father steered me away from that. He said, do economics instead. There's more money in it. So having been a politics lecturer himself, he sort of steered me away from that sort of academic side. But I basically grew up in quite a political household. I suspect that at the time that was unusual. I think nowadays, of course, people are exposed to politics much more. I mean, I know lots of young people who are very aware, for example, of the Black Lives Matter protests or the Green protests, and of course that's the rise of social media. So I think when I was growing up, it was less common to be interested in politics because you had less exposure to it. Now it is far more common, and I think there are lots of things that it's difficult not to have an opinion on, or at least be interested in, because you're bombarded with the images all the time. So my experience is maybe a little bit different. I grew up in quite a political household, but I think nowadays it's very hard not to avoid these issues, even if you don't necessarily have a strong opinion on them.
Absolutely. We have time for one last question here, and this is from Emily. And Emily asks, do you think votes at 16 in the UK will ever become a reality?
Oh, I've got no doubt. I think the direction of travel is clear, and it's a debate that we're having in the UK, but also we're having, or is being had in other countries around the world. So it wasn't so long ago, of course, in the UK that you could only vote if you were a man owning property, or you had to be over a certain age, had to be over 30 or over 21 or something. So there's been a sort of gradual process of extending the franchise to more people. So whether or not you can vote now no longer depends whether or not you're male or female, or whether you own property and so on. I think inevitably there's going to be a step soon, which is that we move to vote at 16 as well.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Julian. And unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. We had a lot of questions submitted, so I'll be sure to send them over to you once talk is finished, so you can see what it was that students were asking and what was at the forefront of their minds today. A huge thank you for joining us and for engaging our audience in a really interesting topic and debate. And I hope students will go away thinking about, voting ages at 16 and whether that's something they think would be a good idea and appropriate or not. But thank you for making the time to be with us today.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So just a quick announcement for students who have tuned in. There is a feedback form that we have shared in the Q&A thread. It'd be fantastic if you could complete that. And if you are completing the student activity sheet for your school or teacher, the colour for today's talk is Kiwi. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, and we hope to see you for future virtual talks. Have a great day, everyone.